It's time for Kadlec on Call on News Radio 610 KONA. It's your chance to learn valuable health information right here in our community. Now, the host of Kadlec on Call, here's Jim Hall.
And good evening and welcome to Kadlec on Call. Every Wednesday at this time, we come your way and spend the hour talking about a specific health or medical topic. Today, as we commemorate Veterans Day, we thought that should be our focus. So we've invited some colleagues from Kadlec Regional Medical Center who have served our country in the armed forces. And as we do that, we want to begin with a thank you to everyone out there who has or is currently serving in the military. Tonight, we have a couple of guests we hope to bring your way. That means work permitting. Live with us, we know one guy that's going to be here because he's live with us in the studio. His name is Gabriel Sims, a veteran of the National Guard who served a tour of duty in Iraq. Gabe is also a nurse practitioner working in the emergency department at Kadlec. We're also hoping to hear from Dr. Fermin Godinez. He's a physician at Kadlec who served 2 tours of duty in Iraq, and he is currently working in the Kadlec emergency department tonight. So depending upon how busy he is, we hope to have him calling in a little bit. And later we plan to talk to Amy Carrasco, who is the Director of Graduate Medical Education at Kadlec and also a U.S. Army vet and comes from a long line in her family of military veterans. So it's certainly not unusual for healthcare workers to serve in the military, as medicine is certainly a calling, and many are called to serve their country too, to fight on behalf of the rest of us and for our freedom. So, and we thank them for that. So first, let's invite Gabe to the microphone. And Gabe, first of all, congratulations. I know you've been a nurse at Kadlec for a number of years, and you just obtained your nurse practitioner credentials. So congratulations. That must be very gratifying to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
I want to spend some time. I had the opportunity today to just spend some time on the phone talking to Gabe about his military background and very fascinating stories to tell about his experiences, and especially when he was deployed to Iraq. But why don't you begin by, for our listeners, just explaining as to what led you to a military career?
Well, like many young people, as they're graduating high school and they looking at their future, they looking at college and maybe wondering about how to pay for it. I have a family history of people serving in the military as well, and I realized that joining the military could help me pay for my education. And so I looked at the different availabilities and really felt like the National Guard was a good option for me. It allowed me to stay local, still serve my community and my country, and help get some education money as well.
And you had mentioned that when you joined the National Guard, you had just returned from a mission for your church, and so that at that time is when you made that decision to join the National Guard. So what is that commitment? Is that situation where you spend like a weekend a month going to serve as the National Guard?
The National Guard is a reserve component unit, and it's 1 weekend a month and then 2 weeks of active duty during the summer. And you do that for a time period, usually about 6 years. You start with training, in basic training, just like any other Army soldier, and learn your job, and come back to the community and resume your life while taking time to serve part-time.
And during this time, your schooling that you mentioned, is that when you set off to your nursing career and to become a nurse? Exactly.
I was interested in the healthcare field, and I knew that CBC had a good program, and so I enrolled there and studied to get my associate's degree so that I could apply to the CBC nursing program.
And so you did and then you ultimately completed the CBC nursing program and began working. Did you always work in the ER? Is that when you went to work at Kadlec? Did you start there or migrate there?
No, I migrated there. I started on the medical floor. I have a lot of great friends there. But I worked there for a year, but I knew that my passion was emergency. And so I was grateful when they took a chance on me and let me train with them and learn, and it's been a fantastic experience.
Now, during this time, you'd said you'd had to commit to 6 years of service. So during this time, it was about the time, during that time was when 9/11 in 2001 came. And so obviously, I'm guessing that changed your picture a little bit.
It did. You know, joining the reserves of the National Guard, you think that it's probably less likely to be deployed. And I was one of those as well, although I knew it was possible.
But when you did, when that call came, when did that call come? And talk us a little bit about what ultimately put you to a deployment in Iraq.
Okay. So many of us realized that we would probably deploy after that time. It wasn't until 2003, late in September or October, we got a call. I was actually at work. They called that we would be getting deployed. So we deployed from here to Fort Lewis to train in November of 2003.
And so you were in Fort Lewis for a period of time, and then ultimately, when did you go to the Middle East?
We were there until April of 2004, and we went to the Middle East then in Kuwait in I think March, actually, of 2004.
For our listeners, then, tell us what your role was when you went there.
I was a cavalry scout, which is quite a bit different than my role as a nurse. I chose that because it looked interesting to me, and I thought it fit part of my personality. But that job is to go behind enemy lines and look for the enemy and report those to our command and assist them in guiding attacks and so forth.
Now, where were you at? Were you in Baghdad itself, or were you out in some of the more countryside areas of the country?
I was in Baghdad itself. The area was probably more of a little bit more of a suburban area of Baghdad versus the city. There were canals and farms, but there were also sections of the city where we were responsible for.
And I would assume you had to have spent a lot of time studying, I guess, the topography and just the maps to familiarize yourself exactly how you could get around there, especially if you were in these missions where your job was to go places where you were going to really invite enemy fire.
Right. We, as a scout, actually, you live on your maps and on the radio. It's not a strong fighting force. It's versatile, but you need to be able to communicate and you need to be able to navigate in order to stay alive.
And are you doing this mostly at night? Are you kind of like night missions to go out and find this intelligence and bring it back? Is that when you primarily did this, or did it matter?
We did it quite a bit at night, which is definitely difficult to navigate more at night. But we did missions during the day and night. It depended on what was needed. Whenever we were needed, we responded to the call.
So you were a scout. So you went out and how big was the group that you went out? Were they small groups of soldiers that went out on these missions?
Usually six soldiers, 2 Humvees.
So you're in 2 Humvees, and you have predetermined areas where you're obviously going to. And what are you looking for?
We're just looking for anything that appears out of the ordinary, or sometimes we would be given specific intelligence to look for. Things that we would key on. We'd take videos, we would take photographs, we would document locations, and come back and report what we'd found. But typically we had an area of interest that we were looking for anything out of the ordinary.
And how often did you come under fire?
Probably a dozen times.
Really? So, and would you go out daily?
We went out, we cataloged our missions, and so I was responsible for about 350 missions.
Wow.
In about 10 months.
With the same group of 6, typically?
Pretty much.
So you got to be a pretty tight group.
We did.
So how, I don't know how else to word this. What was the most dangerous? How close did you come? I would assume you're encountering enemy fire frequently, but how close did you come to really becoming injured or facing something of that nature? Sure.
Our job was sometimes to cause a distraction for the enemy.
So purposely expose yourself.
Exactly. Gain their attention by being obvious and to be used somewhat as bait. The mission was to draw fire.
Wow.
Which fire means armed fire. And so we would go out and be obvious and be this smaller force and try and get people to notice us so that something else could be done with a little bit more surprise.
What was the hardest part? Was it hard to distinguish who the enemy was?
It was very difficult. It's a pretty unstable time for Iraq. There were a lot of armed people out on the streets everywhere protecting people of importance or business or any kind of facility. So there were a lot of men on the streets with AK-47s. We had to watch and observe, and the only way to really tell if they were enemy is if they pointed one at us. Mm-hmm. And other than that, we could drive past an enemy and not know it as long as they didn't point an AK at us.
Now, did you have casualties during these 300-some missions? Did you lose any of your buddies during these missions?
We did.
I'm going to take a break right now. Obviously, this is a tough night for Gabe, but it's certainly we appreciate him taking the time to share the valiant efforts that he and his colleagues provided for us here back at home, all these miles away, and all these years later. We're going to take our first break of the evening, a special edition of Kadlec on Call. Some veterans who work in healthcare, a calling in many, many ways, and we're happy to have Gabe with us. And in a moment, we're going to talk with a physician who, like Gabe, was deployed to Iraq. Back with more of Kadlec on Call in just a moment.
You're listening to Kadlec on Call on 610 KONA. This program provides general information only. Any comments or information presented are strictly for educational purposes. Kadlec and 610 KONA do not endorse any of the suggestions made by the presenter or callers. Now back to Kadlec on Call. Once again, Jim Hall.
And welcome back to our Veterans Day edition of Kadlec on Call. We're spending this hour talking about colleagues from Kadlec Regional Medical Center who also served in the military, and both in a healthcare perspective and in a combat perspective. And as you heard in our first quarter hour with Gabe Sims, who's now a nurse practitioner at Kadlec, he went to nursing school at CBC and just concluded his nurse practitioner master's at WSU and is practicing here in the Tri-Cities in the emergency department. And so a very powerful story. And you know, we're very lucky to have people like Gabe here in our community providing care to patients because, again, that commitment to service there's nothing like it. And we're now going to go to the phone. Dr. Furman Godinez is an emergency room doctor at Kadlec, and he's actually working tonight, so you got a little break in the action, Dr. Godinez.
Yes, sir, just a little bit. Thank you.
Well, I know you and Gabe are acquainted because you worked together in the ER, and did you get to hear a little bit of Gabe telling his stories? I mean, does it bring back memories to you of your service?
Absolutely, and I think people like us who have served kind of communicate, talk a little bit, because it's easier to kind of share experiences and kind of share history because I understand what he's gone through, and he understands what I've gone through in very different roles. And Gabe has had to endure, a lot of things through his bravery and through his service, and with his friends and colleagues. Towards the tail end, he kind of mentioned a little bit about losing folks. It is tough, no matter how many years it's been. You always remember. And again, talking to family members that I have in my own person, my family that have served. Those are the things you bring back, because that's what, the sacrifice for service is, and many have made that ultimate sacrifice, and I think that's why folks like Gabe and I are willing to talk tonight, because it's certainly not about us, but many of the other veterans and colleagues and brothers in arms that we've served with who have gone.
Well said. And in your case, you finished your medical school training prior to being deployed to Iraq, correct?
Yes,
That's
sir.
why you went over there. Tell us a little bit about that and the role that you served when you were over in Iraq.
So I trained was fortunate enough to get a Navy scholarship to pay for medical school, and served, did my residency at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth in Virginia. And as a result, after 9/11, as we were getting ready to deploy in support of combat operations in 2003, my unit, I was attached to what was then called CSSB 22, or it's gone under a couple of different names, but I think most people remember it from a lot of the media as Task Force Tarawa or 2nd MEB. And we met them out in Kuwait prior to the invasion of Iraq during the Operation Iraqi Freedom, and we were staged in Kuwait for about a month or so. We arrived in country back in January and moved forward to the line of departure in an assembly area there. It's kind of the most interesting thing is sleeping on top of a Humvee in an NBC outfit with a gas mask on, seeing Scud missiles and rockets over heading into Kuwait and down to Saudi, and the Patriot batteries firing off and counter to, again, subdue or, directly affect the Scud missiles coming in from Iraq. So it was a different kind of experience. And then from that point forward on to our march in country to Al Jaber in support of combat operations as the Marines were moving forward into Nasiriyah. And unfortunately, as an emergency physician in a shock trauma platoon, our job was to support the combat casualties or any injuries. So we were a pretty mobile, capable medical support element that helped our Marines as they were entering into the city of Nasiriyah during that battle.
So you were in what was called a shock trauma platoon, so in essence a special medical unit to go and support the combat troops as they were moving their way into Iraq.
Correct. We were two emergency physicians. It just so happened that my partner was a critical care pulmonologist, a guy by the name of Jeff Timby, who had served with the SEAL teams before. And then my background was mostly Fleet Marine Force or with the Marines in Greenside. And we had a physician who was Tammy Moore, and we had about 15, 20 Navy personnel that were designed and the brainchild of a couple of guys, Harry Bowman, to support combat operations. So we were out of a couple of trucks. We were able to get our boxes out of the back, set up a tent, and start treating patients in less than 25, 30 minutes, and then break it down and start moving and support the moving elements in about 30 minutes as well. So we were pretty mobile kind of unit. Our design, again, was to take care of, unfortunately, the combat casualties and any other casualties that we may have suffered, to include enemy prisoners of war.
So how close were you to the front lines? Were they bringing them back to you a certain distance of miles? Obviously, you had to be safe enough away to where you could set up your tents and do your medical treatment.
And we were at different phases of the operation. Mm-hmm. We were so when we first started during the battle, and so we started moving, there was a unfortunate group of the 507th Maintenance folks that Jessica Lynch and their group was captured. And during then, we started getting some of the casualties from the Army 507th that had been injured, but also some of our Marines that were in there trying to help protect them and engage with the enemy. So that was probably about 15, 20 miles away. Mm-hmm. And then as we moved outside the city, we could actually see the tanks, and we could see the enemy and moving around, and we could see the Iraqi Republican Guard and their tanks and their mobile units positioning. And so we were far enough forward where we could actually get ground evacuations and ground casualties them out of the city in about 5 to 10 minutes, and by air very shortly thereafter. And in ground combat element, we're usually behind the artillery, but at this point we were actually in front of it. It was a few miles behind us, so reasonably close during that phase. Now,
the casualties that you would encounter were most of them from the rocket-propelled grenades and then whatever the explosive devices, IEDs, I think they called them, or were there more, or as many, were there gunshot type wounds type things, or was it a combination of everything?
It was a combination of a number of different things, but primarily what we saw were the people getting shot. Our guys who were engaged. At that point in time, there wasn't that many improvised explosive devices. It was before the insurgency really started. Mm-hmm. During that, what we call the maneuver phase of the Task Force Terror and moving into Nasiriyah, securing the bridges, and then actually securing the bridges and making safe, us trying to move forward through that area. But it was more like gunshot wounds, people in tanks getting burned, the folks getting shot, our Marines getting shot, some unfortunately from heavy artillery from their side as well. So it was a variety of different injuries, but not many as far as explosives unless it was due to the vehicle being detonated.
And in your situation, you're having to do this medical treatment under fire yourselves frequently?
Not frequently. Fortunately, there was probably one night, the night that comes to mind is March 26th, there was an ambush that was set up as we were a support element, and they tried to overrun our area where we were setting up, taking care of casualties. And so that night we ended up taking care of close to 50 folks, both enemy Republican and enemy prisoners of war, some civilians, and our own Marines as well during that time. So it was about 24 hours, and there was probably about 6 to 8 hours of really intense fighting where you would have rockets, you would have the tracers, and it was really kind of more close fighting is what I would say. Going through the cities and going through afterwards, you'd get some sporadic, but not to the same intensity, not the same amount of forces during that night where you're engaged with an enemy in a more of a conventional type of warfare for 6 to 8 hours during heavy fire.
Have about a minute before we go to our next break, but before we do, give me an idea of just what is your mindset in this situation? Is it just like you are when you work in the ER, that I have a job to do and, I may see a lot of bad stuff, but I have a job to do? Is that the mindset that you have in that situation, Doctor?
I think Jim and Gabe can tell you this as well. It's just before you jump off to get into the mission, just before you start your task. These are guys you eat with. These are guys you lived with. You were shipboard with. I mean, these are for lack of a better, these are the guys you're taking care of. You're there. It's very different mindset when it's us versus them. You're going to do whatever it takes, and I think people sometimes think about getting hurt, but I think my mindset was I didn't want to let them down. I just wanted to make sure that I was as well prepared that I could be to do whatever I can to make sure they all come home. And I think that was our mindset. That's what we trained so many years to do in our unit with the corpsmen. All the training we did before we deployed and before we got into country was all about executing. Just doing the best possible job to give our Marines the best chance of coming home well.
That's Dr. Furman Godinez, ER physician at Kadlec and a veteran of the Iraq War, 2 tours of duty. Again, a special edition of Kadlec on Call focusing on Veterans Day on this November 11th. We have to take our bottom hour of the break. Dr. Godinez, can you hang out for a few more minutes?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Take our next break. I'll be back on the other side with more of Kadlec on Call in just a moment.
You're listening to Kadlec on Call on 610 KONA. This program is not a substitute for direct consultation with your own healthcare provider. Always consult your healthcare provider for your specific condition, especially if you have or suspect you may have a medical problem. Now back to Kadlec on Call. Here again, Jim Hall.
And tonight we're consulting a couple special medical providers. They are veterans who work at Kadlec Regional Medical Center in the emergency department. Dr. Furman Godinez, who is an emergency room physician, and Gabe Sims, who is a newly minted nurse practitioner, but has been an emergency room nurse at Kadlec for a number of years. And very fascinating first half hour to hear their experiences of both being deployed to Iraq. And Dr. Godinez is currently working in the ER. And thank you for hanging out for a few more minutes. I wanted to have you, before we let you go, dialogue with Gabe a little bit. I know you guys see each other at work and talk occasionally about your past experiences, but I guess I want to resume the conversation. You touched on the work that you did and how vital it was just to do your job the best you can for the Marines that you were serving. Some of these Marines that you were serving and soldiers that you were serving, where I think we don't realize who haven't been to war, these are 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, aren't they?
And brave. I think Gabe and I have talked about it a few times. I've mentioned it to other folks. During the first contact, we were March 26th. We were there at night when we got our first big ambush, and the firefight started. First time I'd ever been in combat, first time I'd really been in a hostile firefight. And, the first thing that I know is there's a Lance Corporal King, who's probably 19, grabbing my flak and telling me to get down and get for cover. And his thought is not about himself, but protecting me. And I don't know where they find them, but, they mold them and they make them really special. So they're really good at what they do. And I got to tell you, we Gabe can talk to it as well as the guys you train with, but where they find them and how they mold them. There's some real special, brave folks that we have, and we're a very fortunate nation to have men and women who are willing to step up. And, my job is to be a physician, not to be brave. Those guys get after it and take care of each other, and they're fierce.
Well, and I think you used the term, and I think you were throwing a compliment Gabe's way, but I think you used the term, he's the one in the dirt. Tell me what that means.
They're the ones forward. They're the ones out in the, I have Marines protecting me. I'm in a, they're trying to do the best job they can to make sure I'm secured and safe. He's out there doing the mission. He's out there walking the ground. He's out there exposed, interacting with the folks that you're trying to determine who is friend or foe. He's out there exposed. He's doing the mission. He's in the Humvee. He's out there standing watch on the corner. It's a very, very different threat. I mean, his is a much more dangerous position and a much more dangerous job, and their groups do it every day, all day. Like you said, 300, that's sometimes multiple times a day, 10 months, not too many weeks, and that's really getting after it.
Talk to me a little bit, Gabe, about, and you too, Dr. Godinez, about the conditions as far as, obviously we know the weather, especially during the summer, had to be unbelievable, and you weren't able to put on your shorts and tank tops, right?
Gabe, tell them what you wore in your Humvee.
Oh, we wore, by weight, we wore about 75 pounds of gear. We wore boots, long socks, pants, long sleeve shirts. You have to wear a tank top underneath. Usually gloves, just because everything you touch is so hot that it's actually cooler to have gloves on your hand so you don't burn your hands when you touch things. A helmet, which is obviously heavy and hot. Glasses to protect your eyes in case things explode. Armor, which we were blessed to have armor by the time that I deployed, which is also quite hot, several layers of Kevlar. There's no air conditioning in the Humvees, so it can be pretty easily 150 degrees inside a Humvee and 120 plus on the street, and you just soak your body in sweat every single day.
So do you, before you're actually getting in country, as you called it, are you, I'm guessing, acclimated? They acclimate you to get you ready for the heat that you're going to be facing, and obviously in all the weight and everything else that you're packing.
You have to, yeah. You have to acclimate to something like that, or you just won't. You won't be able to function. You'll go see Dr. Godinez and get yourself an IV and a little bit of good-natured ribbing, probably. But yeah, you have to acclimate. The body has to become accustomed to that kind of thing.
Is that what you've encountered too, Dr. Godinez?
It was hot. My first deployment, we fortunately showed up when it was cold. It was January when we were in Kuwait and moved in country February, March. But by May, June, it got about 100, 110, 115. My next deployment, we were there in July of 2004, and so it's pretty hot during the day. And as Gabe said, Gabe had mentioned, whenever you move, you just start dripping sweat. See, when they get you into Kuwait, they fly you in, and you start getting used to the heat, and you're usually there for about a week or so, hydrating, drinking water, eating good food to try to get ready for that. It's amazing that a culture who's been there for a millennia, they've adapted to being in the shade in the afternoon. And typically, and Gabe can attest more, the contact and the encounters are typically on those times of the day that are a little bit less, tolerable, so you're out and running around. But the heavy body armor, you walk around a little bit, you sweat a fair bit, and there's no AC. And we saw some injuries, but not too many. But it's pretty hostile. It's a pretty hostile work environment.
And in your case, I got to let you go because I know you're busy tonight. But I want to have you just one more question before we let you go, and that's, in this environment, it just strikes me amazing that you both talk about, you go out on your missions. In your case, when you're out in these shock platoons, trauma platoons, are you out in the field for hours, days at a time, where you're not able to go back and take a break?
There were times when, probably during the 23rd and 24th, when we crossed the line of departure, there was 2 separate times where we were up and moving and receiving casualties and treating patients for about 24 to 36 hours each of those stretches. And then you're just up. You're tense up. You start treating patients. You get a phone call. You're in a convoy. We get a phone call that we have casualties. They pull off to the side of the road. They set up to make sure that it's safe. We pitch our tent. We start receiving helicopters in the middle of the desert, and we start treating patients. And it can be a few hours, or like I said, up to 36 hours straight. The one night we were established, we were there for about 36. So we're with our equipment 24/7. We don't leave it. So it's not one of those positions or jobs where you don't get a timeout. You are there to provide medical care 24/7, and that's what's expected, and that's what we provide.
Before we let you go, just some concluding thoughts, maybe not only to Gabe and colleagues that you served with, but maybe to other veterans who might be out listening tonight on this Veterans Day, a takeaway message from someone who has been there like you have, Dr. Godinez.
My great, profound, and great appreciation for all that those have served, especially those ahead of us. We were very, very fortunate to have good equipment. I was very fortunate to be with the Marines and taken care of, but so many veterans, we were welcomed home. But the folks that I've had a chance to speak from World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, and the Operation, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, they really paved the way for us. I am so grateful for all that they've done, moving the rock forward and up the hill, and I'm so proud to be considered among them and very humbled by their service.
Well, thank you for your service, and thank you for your service to patients, too, here in the Tri-Cities. I know it's not easy work, whether you're in the field in Iraq or here in a hospital setting. We appreciate all the work that all of the healthcare workers here in the Tri-Cities do, and we appreciate you taking the time, Dr. Godinez, tonight.
Thank you for your time, and Gabe, thank you for your service, and you guys, and thank you for remembering us. You guys have a great night.
All right. Dr. Furman Godinez, the emergency room physician at Kadlec Regional Medical Center and a member of a shock trauma platoon back in Iraq, back in the early to mid 2000s. We appreciate his time tonight. We have to take our final break of the evening. When we come back, we're going to get a little different perspective. Someone who has served in the military and is part of a family who has served in the military. Get that unique story as well. I have to take our final break of the evening of Kadlec on Call. Back with our remaining minutes in just a minute.
You're listening to Kadlec on Call on 610 KONA. This program provides general information only. Any comments or information presented are strictly for educational purposes. Kadlec and 610 KONA do not endorse any of the suggestions made by the presenter or callers. Now back to Kadlec on Call. Once again, Jim Hall.
And just a couple of minutes left on our Veterans Day edition of Kadlec on Call. And before we leave the air tonight, we're going to go back to the phones. A colleague of mine, Amy Carrasco, she's the Director of Graduate Medical Education at Kadlec, which means she's in charge of putting together the residency program. We're training family physicians, and I know you're right in the middle of a dinner, right? You're recruiting for the next crop, Amy?
That's correct. We've had quite an outpouring of interest with our program, and we'll interview about 10 candidates every week until the end of January.
That's for another program. Tonight, we wanted to bring you on and talk about your military background. You served in the U.S. Army, and share a little bit about your background and how you were led to join the armed services, Amy, and maybe a little bit about your family history, as I understand that had some connection.
Yeah, I have a strong family history with the military. Both my grandfathers, my uncle, cousin, and my stepdad were all in the service. And then my mom was a single mom raising my sister and I. And to help support that, she went off and joined the Army Reserves when I was probably in late elementary school. And so I watched my mom go through, basic training and do her 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year, and was impressed and influenced by that. And so when I was in college at the University of Idaho, needed some additional income, and my mom's unit actually had a signing bonus because they were trying to get people into that specialty, and so convinced me to go ahead and sign up for the Army Reserves. And I'm glad that I did it.
So what did your career? So you did that. You tell us a little bit about, because yours was during the first Gulf War period.
That's correct. I signed up for the Army Reserves, and it's a 8-year agreement when you do that. So 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year. However, in 1990, our unit, which was the 244th Personnel Service Unit out of Fort Douglas, Utah, in Salt Lake, was activated to go overseas. And so we did a big caravan and went over to Fort Lewis, where we were supposed to be shipped out. But they realized at that time that they had not sent reservists or National Guard service members overseas before. So they sent our active duty counterparts and retained us there to create the regulations and procedures and the computer program on how to send National Guard and reservists overseas, and then also how to process them and bring them home. So I was at Fort Lewis, Washington for 6 months, and then at Fort Douglas, Utah for another 6 months after that during Desert Storm.
So were you gearing up mentally that you were going to probably have to go to the Middle East, or did you know all along that you probably wouldn't, or what was that like?
No, I actually thought that we would go overseas, and I had actually kept calling my mom to tell her to prepare and get the situation taken care of with my sister, because she was only 15 years old and I was in college. And Mom's like, "You're upsetting us. Don't call us anymore." But then in January, I got the call that I'd been activated, and I called Mom at work, and she's like, "Oh no," trying to figure out what to do. No, I actually wanted to go overseas, and so when our unit didn't get to go overseas, there was an opportunity later when I was at Fort Douglas in Utah that you could volunteer to go overseas. And so they called me and they said, "Sergeant Sweetwood," because that's my maiden name, your number's been selected to go overseas. And I panicked and wanted to call my dad, because close Army family, and couldn't get a hold of him, and decided that I would go anyway. But there were so many volunteers that when I called back, they said, "Your volunteer number's already been given to someone else," and so I couldn't go, which is fine. I think all things happen for a reason, and
Sure.
I was really proud and honored to serve my country, and it's actually something that I miss as far as being part of the military. I'm just really happy that it's a part of my life and who I am.
Well, we just have a couple of minutes left. I want to give you one last opportunity and Gabe the final word, just maybe a message to your fellow veterans and maybe those of us who haven't had to serve of what this day means to you and maybe throughout the year, not just on Veterans Day. Start with you, Amy.
Okay, yeah. Well, from my standpoint, I think my experience with Desert Storm and, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, I have lost friends, and it's been a challenge to kind of go through those emotions and struggle. And I'm grateful every day for all the Americans who make a decision to put their own life on the line and are willing to give, so that we do have freedom. And I'm just grateful every day to live in this great country.
And Gabe Sims, newly minted nurse practitioner and a veteran of the National Guard who served in Iraq. You get the final word, maybe your concluding message, Gabe.
Sure. Well, thank you, Tim. I feel honored to have served. I like Amy. I'm just so grateful to be able to live in such a wonderful nation with such wonderful people. And, if I could, if I can get this out, just reach out to those veterans who are suffering.
Well, Gabe, I want to thank you. I know it's still very fresh for you guys. And Amy, thank you for taking the time. And Dr. Furman Godinez, who's back at work in the ER at Kadlec, the work you do every day is, I guess, just a small microcosm of the work you did in the military, serving others. And I want to thank you all for your service, and all you veterans out there listening tonight. We thank you for your service on this Veterans Day, and let's make every day a Veterans Day so that we always remember, as Gabe said, and reach out to the people in need. Thank you for listening to a special edition of Kadlec on Call. Have a wonderful week, and thank you for your service. Good night.